Good afternoon and welcome to the British Academy. We are gathered virtually for this second Purpose Summit, brought together by our Future of the Corporation program. The British Academy's purpose is to deepen understanding of people, societies, and cultures, enabling everyone to learn, progress, and prosper. And that is exactly what we are doing with this program and this event. We are delighted to have such a fantastic group of leaders and experts to offer their reflections and insights into the topic, and I'm sure we can expect a rich discussion. The Future of the Corporation program would not have been possible without the generous support from our principal and associate supporters, as well as our corporate partners, to whom we are all very grateful. Without further ado, I'm delighted to hand you over to your chair for this event, a fellow of the British Academy, Professor Julia Black. Julia Black is Strategic Director of Innovation and Professor of Law at the London School of Economics. She is an external member of the Bank of England's Prudential Regulation Authority. She is also a senior independent member of the board of the UK Research and Innovation Council, a member of the Prime Minister's Council of Science and Technology. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'm particularly delighted that in July 2021, Julia Black will become the British Academy's 31st president. Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Molly, and welcome to everybody this afternoon. It's wonderful to have you with us. We are in the second of this series of events on principles for a purposeful business, and our theme today is how can government promote purposeful business through law, regulation, rules and standards. And I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel with me this afternoon to help us talk through some of the issues which are involved. I'll be introducing each one in turn, but you can find all details of their bios, etc. Online. So what we will be doing is we'll have a discussion. Each person will present their thoughts, and we will be then leaving time for Q&A at the end. So could you please put your questions on the Slido? So you'll have the link to Slido embedded in the live stream on the page. And if you could just use the hashtag Purpose Summit from the start. And I'll be picking up those questions as we go through. So as I say, we have a very full agenda this afternoon, a very important agenda. And a list of incredibly interesting speakers who I am personally really waiting to hear from. So I'm going to turn without further ado to our first panelist this afternoon, Saka Nusseibeh. Saka is CEO of the international business of Federated Hermes and a member of the Federated Hermes executive team and founder of the 300 Club, and was an inaugural member of the CFA's Institute Future of Finance Advisory Council, and was awarded a CBE in 2020 for services to responsible business and finance. So Saka, could you please give us your investor perspective on this very important question?
Thank you very much. And I'm going to start with three apologies. One, because I want to put a lot in, I'm going to speak very fast, so I apologize. Secondly, I am in the company of some extraordinary academic talent, and I'm not one, therefore I'll probably speak less well than all of you. And thirdly, I am prone to heresy, so I will speak heresy if that's okay. So without further ado, here is the background for where we are and what we need to do to change in our view and in my view as an investor. The shift that's happened in investment is over the last 40 odd years has been a democratization of savings. By that, I mean that the owners of capital now are essentially middle-class people in the developed world, primarily, who own a lot of the companies that are quoted on the board, 70, 80 trillion of savings. Through this ownership, they own the companies, the financial companies that generate more capital. So that's the first one. The second shift that's happened is that the function of stock markets and companies no longer meets what it's meant to do in economic theory. That was pointed out by Professor Kay some time ago. Companies don't come to the market to raise capital. Companies just exist on the market. There's a lot of investment that's gone into index investment. So what purpose does it really serve? We'd argue there is a purpose. I'll come to that in a second, but that's a major shift. And the third one is, as this industry of savings has grown and expanded, and I was lucky to see the rise of asset management from '86, because we're humans, we developed a heuristic. And the heuristic is that the purpose of investment is simply financial returns, which is nonsense, actually, and has led to a lot of problems. So these are the three backgrounds, and it brings us to where we are today. Now, let's go back to the first point, the democratization issue. Because there's been this democratization of savings, a lot of practitioners, possibly even government, fail to see that there is, if you do a Venn diagram, in fact, there is a crossover between shareholders and workers, because the shareholders are collectively the workers. The shareholders collectively are the ones who live in society. So the decisions that companies make actually affect not just their shareholders, but also affect the society and also affect their workers, and they all are more or less one and the same. That's the first element. The second one is, it's clear to us that short-term decisions that might meet the financial heuristic of financial returns can have huge damaging effects in the long term, which actually are financially negative. A very simple way of expanding this is to talk about global warming. But you can make it in all kinds of decisions. And that's where some 10 years ago, we started talking about the concept of holistic return, which is every decision has to be weighed against not just the financial return on the investment itself, but any positive or negative effects of that decision that eventually the shareholder, the saver, has to pay for himself. We started with Ed when he joined us talking about, before we came on, the last financial crisis. And here's a very good way to visualize this. People could have made an argument in the stock markets that investing for their savers in investment banks between, say, 2000 and 2007 was a very good investment because the returns on them were very high. However, as a result of all the financial engineering that happened and the crash that followed, the price paid by all of us far outweighs any gains that they would have done. And since these same shareholders are the ones who live in society, and they bear the burden of additional taxation and loss of GDP for society, in reality, holistically, it was a bad investment. So we come to our contention that actually sustainable investment, one done in the long term, that has a holistic viewpoint, meaning that demands from companies to think in a much wider view than simply short-term financial metrics, is in fact the only way that you can invest to increase returns financially in the long term, is the only way that you can invest in a way that serves society and the stakeholders, and is the only sustainable model, because other than that, it will break down. In the last 2 minutes, what can governments do, and why do we think we're at a turning point? We're at a turning point because society has now shifted. You can see this in the way that ESG has been accepted. A few years ago, there was a really, really nice article written about me in the Financial Times, which said I was a hippie in the city, which was really nice. I miss being hippie by about 5 years. I wish I were. I can sing and play John Byers, but I'm not a hippie. But the point is that what we used to talk about was seen as almost eccentric and tree hugging. Now everybody accepts that sustainable investing is the way forward. Everybody thinks ESG is good. Everybody's talking about how companies with purpose, in fact, can enhance returns in the long term. So it's moved to the mainstream. Why? Because society has moved. Look at the way that we've dealt with this pandemic. Society now recognizes that the old system has issues. How can we solve it? We need 3 things, I think. The first one is we need to academically accept or visualize or be able to articulate the idea that there is no contradiction between investing in a responsible manner for the whole of society and between, in fact, enhancing long-term returns. That there is not, you don't lose something financially by doing something else. In fact, if you look over the long term, holistically, there is no contradiction. The second, and for that, you need some change of the law, particularly in the United States, and the way that you articulate fiduciary duty in the United States, which is very specific. The law in Europe is beginning to change. The second one, which is also related to law, is to come academically to an understanding that when we own on behalf of our clients shares in companies, the function is not just allocating capital, because we're not really, we're just holding the companies. It is stewardship, the stewardship of capital, the stewardship of long-term decisions, the stewardship of the planet that we hold in trust for the next generation to come. And that also requires an understanding and possibly a change in the law. And then the final one is we need an agreed language. And that's where we look to Janine's SASB and an attempt to come out with a common language that investors can use and be held to account for, or rather agents of investors, because we're just agents, And again, we need to agree collectively in the same way that post the crash in 29-30, the Companies Act became the basis of agreeing a language of accounting, which was then imitated by the Companies Act in the States, although it had its own issues there because of the issue of federalism in the States. But in the same way, we need to move forward in coming out with a language in which we decide how we can judge companies holistically, if you like. So it's an exciting time. I think we have society now moving. I think the investment community, or the investment agent community, to be sure, has moved, but it's time to remove the barriers in a sense. And that is not just a matter of law, that's also a matter of renewing the language that we use around investment and renewing the language that you use about returns and accepting that, in fact, this should be about stewardship. And I'll finish with two dictums. One, being good is good business, and we can prove that. I apologize, that's my coffee machine switching off. And number two, that ultimately investment has to be about stewardship, and stewardship therefore is about purpose. 6 minutes, I think.
Perfect, bang on time. So you've given us a fantastic opening there, but also some very significant challenges. Thinking about accepting the idea, and I'll be able to articulate the idea that responsible investment and long-term financial returns are synergistic. Changing the function of investing from capital allocation to a wider one of stewardship and this agreed language. And we will be picking up on a number of these as we go through the afternoon. But one of the questions which has come up already on from those who are listening hits on this point that you made about duties and fiduciary duties, and goes to the issue of corporate purposes and whether corporate purposes should be articulated in a company's constitution. Obviously, we have the objects. There'll be here a qualitative difference then between objects and purpose. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that particular very topical issue right now?
So I think it does make sense to articulate purpose, and not just object, but purpose, and that the purpose should be wider than just doing a job. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And we can go into a long discussion about this, but in reality, companies acknowledge de facto that they have a purpose more than just making money, right? They acknowledge that by the services they provide to the community they live in. They acknowledge that by the way they react with the government that governs them and so on. It's just we're not articulating that in the governance. And that then would open the door for a better sense of articulating fiduciary duty in a way that encompasses more than just looking at the P&L of the company over 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years.
Fascinating. So again, we're going to return to this, but it does go, and Janine, if I may turn to you to pick up this point on narrative and also theories of change. So just before I do, I just want to introduce you, however, to everybody listening and watching with us this afternoon. So Janine Guillot is Chief Executive Officer of the SASB Foundation. And prior to joining SASB, Janine served as the Chief Operating Investment Officer for CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System. Even when I was teaching corporate law and studying corporate law, that was the activist investor that was in all the textbooks, and that was some time ago. Janine's also held senior leadership positions at Barclays, Bank of America, and in Capture LP. So Janine, could I hand over to you now, please, to talk us through your own thoughts and perspective on this?
Yes, and it's terrific to follow soccer, because our work at SASB and what I'm passionate about is making sure that people like soccer have the information they need to ultimately, whether you call it sustainable investing or ESG integration, and there are lots of terms used, but I think of those terms broadly as meaning integrating sustainability considerations or environmental and social governance considerations into investment decision making. And that's been a goal of a lot of organizations for a long time. But one of the challenges in doing that in any kind of a rigorous or scalable or cost-effective way has always been information and data, and investment processes run on data. And what's really been missing is comparable, consistent, and reliable data about sustainability factors, and a better understanding of how those sustainability factors link to particularly long-term financial performance and long-term enterprise value. So what we do at SASB, and I think standards are really one of the key tools here as we think collectively about how to move society forward. What we do at SASB is we set standards for disclosure by companies to their investors. We identify the sustainability issues that are most likely to impact financial performance in specific industries. And then we suggest metrics for companies to measure progress or performance on those issues. What we're really trying to do here is to shift the conversation from transparency to performance. Transparency is great, but at the end of the day, transparency is a means to an end. And we think that end is improved performance on sustainability issues. And the way you improve performance, it's like any other, like we've said for decades, what gets measured gets managed, and you improve performance by having clear and comparable metrics. So we always use the example of financial accounting standards. I'm really grateful Soccer mentioned the history of financial accounting standards. Today, we tend to take financial accounting standards for granted. But financial accounting standards did in fact only come into being in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And so we use that analogy of financial accounting standards to say, how can we get to a similar place with sustainability disclosure standards? Because what financial accounting standards did is they created this common language, and they created a common language between companies and investors for talking about financial performance. They enabled benchmarking. They enabled competition to improve performance. And how can we create that same dynamic with sustainability performance that enables benchmarking, target setting, and you get that natural competitive cycle of companies competing to improve performance on sustainability metrics, where you can then see improved performance across entire industries. So that's what we're trying to do. We often say that accounting standards are market infrastructure, and how can we embed sustainability disclosure standards into core market infrastructure? And that would be securities regulation, and let's call it the kind of core accounting standard setting infrastructure through IFRS Foundation, FASB, and country level standard setters around the world. Now, I've been at SASB 5 years, and 5 years ago when I joined SASB, and we very much had this vision of how do you embed this information into the core market infrastructure. I would have told you that was a 20 or 30-year goal before anyone was going to be paying attention to this. What's amazing to me is that we're now in a situation where the IFRS Foundation, which is the parent of the IASB, just issued a consultation on whether they should play a role in sustainability disclosure. IOSCO, which is the global umbrella organization for securities market regulators, capital markets regulators, is looking actively at corporate disclosure and whether they could play a role or should play a role in sustainability disclosure. The UK FCA has been a real leader in this space. And so to me, the fact that this conversation has moved from what I would say is 5 years ago, like Soccer, no one ever accused me of being a hippie, but I would say that 5 years ago, this conversation was kind of a niche conversation. And sustainability disclosure and standards for sustainability disclosure is now a mainstream conversation, I think is a sign of how rapid society is changing and how rapidly this conversation about the purpose of the corporation is evolving. So I'll stop right there because I've said a lot, but I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Janine. And as you say, this debate has moved on in strides over the last 5 years, and really and not at a linear pace over that time either, as it has really accelerated, I think, over the last 12 to 18 months. And I'm just thinking as we look across different models of global standards that we have around the world. Obviously in accounting, as you say, you've got the ISAB and the IFRS standards, but we also have US GAAP. and those are quite different structures, and the state has a different role in those different structures. Where if you go to financial regulation, for example, then as you say, you've got IOSCO, you've got the, and ultimately you've got sort of head of global, as it were, which is the Financial Stability Board, which has more state presence, more government presence within those structures. So I was just thinking, and IOSCO is part of that sort of agglomeration, as it were, or system of regulation. Where do you think this is going to go? I mean, at the moment we have a sort of battle for regulatory share, as it were, across these different bodies. How do you think this is going to play out if you roll forward, perhaps even just 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, so it's complicated. I mean, there are numerous tensions in trying to design a global system here. Is it do you look at regional solutions? Do you look at global solutions? Do you look at industry specific? Do you look at industry agnostic? What's your definition of materiality, which is heavily influenced by some of the fiduciary law considerations? So it is difficult to think you can get just one comprehensive solution that meets everyone's needs. But the way we think about this is very much in building blocks. We use these building blocks language, and we think it is reasonable to think we could try to get one foundational baseline of standards in place to serve the capital markets. And that could potentially be a global solution under the IFRS foundation. And then regionally, where different regional regulators do have different levels of ambition, or they're operating in different legal environments, different regional regulators can then amend or top up those requirements as appropriate. But we think it's essential to try to get one foundational baseline. The real challenge always ends up being, when you try to get a global baseline, is that principles based? Is it very qualitative? Is it metrics based? And we think it's essential to get some level of a metrics based global baseline for all of the big investors who have global portfolios to be able to compare performance. So that's a little bit of thinking there. The other thing that we think is really important is that this be a public-private hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the really effective things about financial accounting standards.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about who sets financial accounting standards, they're essentially private organizations with significant market input coming from both companies, investors, and the accounting firms, but they are endorsed or supported or mandated by public entities. And so we think that kind of public-private hybrid model works very, very well, and ideally would be replicated for sustainability disclosure.
Excellent. Huge amounts. I could monopolize the conversation here, and we could just talk for hours about each one of the things that our panelists are talking about. But again, we're just going to hold those thoughts there about how do we attain commensurability with some metrics whilst allowing for tailoring and all of those difficult issues, but absolutely essential to get resolved. So let's hold on to those thoughts. And Rebecca, if I may, if we could move on to you now. So just to introduce you first to everybody who's with us today. So Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty MacArthur University Professor at Harvard University, a research fellow at the US National Bureau of Economic Research, and her work focuses on innovation and organizational change, exploring how the private sector can play a major role in building a more sustainable economy. And she's also a corresponding fellow at the British Academy, which is obviously the most important part of all the different roles that you have, Rebecca. So Rebecca, please, over to you.
Julia, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. How can government make a difference in accelerating purpose-driven firms? It's very tempting to believe that if it's profitable and obviously a business case to act with purpose, that firms will just leap into the breach. But alas, that is not the case. My colleagues on the panel, Saka and Janine, have pointed out that we need to rewire finance to really accelerate this transition, that we need to be clear that it is in the interests of investors for firms to act from purpose, and that we need to change the accounting system so that we can measure how they're doing and track their progress and have a conversation about being purpose-driven. I think that's incredibly important, but I think it's not enough. I spent the first 20 years of my career studying change in large organizations. I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management at MIT, which was a coincidence, but deeply ironic. And I spent a year of my life in Finland trying to persuade Nokia that Apple was a genuine threat. Even in the case of a firm like Nokia, which could sort of see there was a problem, they had enormous difficulty changing. And we face the same difficulty now. I am firmly convinced that there is a better way to run firms. I think we have strong quantitative and qualitative data suggesting that the embrace of purpose is not only profitable, but makes a huge difference to the society around us. And yet many firms are hesitating. So what can business do? Oh, I'm sorry. What can government do to accelerate this transition? I have two ideas. The first is to change the context. It's a lot easier to be purpose-driven if the temptation to behave badly is reduced. So the old-fashioned block and tackling, environmental regulation, some kind of price or regulation for climate, sensible labor regulation, minimum wage, perhaps a collective voice for employees, strong free press. The kinds of forces that can act on firms from the outside to force them to be purpose-driven are incredibly helpful. So often when I'm working with purpose-driven firms, they tell me what they're doing and they say, you know, it's hard. We're trying to raise our wages, but our competitors across the street, they're keeping them low. We're trying to use only sustainably sourced products, but it's so easy to buy the bad stuff. Fundamental role for government is making sure that behaving badly is more difficult. Secondly, government could perhaps accelerate this transition. It's, as I think Saka said, a change in language, a change in framing, a change in understanding. That sounds very grandiose, but at another level, it's just a different way of managing firms. We need firms to run what I think of as a high commitment employment model, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, paid reasonably, given a voice in the firm and room to contribute. We need firms to, in Professor Colin Meyer's wonderful words, solve public problems, not create them. How do we nudge firms in that direction? Most obviously through education and research. And here I am, an academic, but I really do believe that rigorous research showing that different ways of managing yield better returns is a very important part of this transition. Bringing firms together with each other to exchange best practice, share ideas, holding up really good examples of how this can be done. So education is one lever. Another is conversation across boundaries, and perhaps legalizing active cooperation in pursuit of the common good. In the US, for example, Walmart is keen to increase average wage across its employee base, raise their educational levels, and create career ladders. But that's super hard to do for a single firm. So they're trying to pull their competitors together, saying, let's jointly fund education, let's raise wages together, let's make sure that there are places for these workers to go. When they hold these meetings, you have to have wall-deep antitrust lawyers in the room. But this kind of cooperation in the public good, could, I think, make an enormous difference. Because one of the things that drives change in any organization is the perception that everybody else is doing it. So if government can make that kind of within industry, within region cooperation easier, if government can play a role in those conversations, I know many government people who are kind of suspicious of business, let me be stronger, who are tempted to think that firms are sometimes evil. Firms can do terrible things, but I believe that there is a strong push to change the orientation of the private sector, and that government would find willing partners in many firms. That's a voice that has to be learned, a conversation that has to be built, trust that has to be created. But we could imagine public-private partnerships not only around accounting standards, as Janine suggests, but around reinvigorating regions, improving the efficacy of education, changing how we think about the workforce, addressing our environmental problems. So in summary, government has a huge role to play. Yes, we need to rewire finance. Yes, we need to change the governance of companies. And I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk about this. But we also need to change the rules so behaving badly is less tempting, and teach and support firms in their transition to this new model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. There's so much there. And I think what you articulate very well is the sort of the push-pull dynamic between the private sector, between government and the private sector, and each pushing the other and pulling the other simultaneously, or as it were, and the interaction of those different forces. And obviously that can produce a negative force, but we're hoping that that's going to produce a positive force. And I think that links very well with some of the questions which are coming in from those who are listening around how do we help businesses understand and report on and articulate the value that they're creating, I suppose, moving beyond environmental sustainability. And the question is specifically towards that they're contributing to natural, social and human capital. Help them articulate that, perhaps report on that, use that in their decision making. So what kind of further steps do you think we can make in that direction?
So this is where Saker and Janine went, and developing these kinds of standards is critical. But let me give some ideas. Most firms do not report on their turnover rates, on internal education, on the engagement surveys they run, on the structure of the organization and the allocation of power and decision-making. That's a hard one. But arguably, keeping track of how much we pay, how much we train, how happy and engaged people are in their work is something that every investor should be interested in, arguably every consumer and every potential employee. And if everyone were reporting those kinds of metrics, one might, I think, begin to see a very different approach to managing in many firms.
Thank you. So again, more for us to pick up on. But Raghu, I want to turn to you now, if I may, next to help us take this discussion forward. And just for those of you who are with us, Professor Rajan is the Catherine Dusac Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at Chicago Booth, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, of course, and between 2003 and 2006 was chief economist and director of research at the IMF. Raghu has written several books, including Fault Lines, How the Hidden Fractures Still Threaten the World Economy. Raghu, over to you.
Thank you very much. And, those were fascinating presentations before me. Let me see if I can add a little something. And I'm going to talk about the fact that there is certainly immense pressure for corporations to do something more than make a good widget today. And part of it comes from the problems we have in society: rising inequality, left behind communities, racial disparities, and of course, looming climate change. And the fact that government is, in many countries, paralyzed in the face of these changes and is not doing enough. So clearly, we want somebody to do something, and we put a lot of pressure on corporations. I believe there's immense room for improvement in corporate behavior. But I also don't want to take the pressure off governments. Often the best answer is for them to step up what they ought to do and not push businesses to fill the gap. So that's broadly where I'm going. Let me emphasize that corporations have been thinking about their mandates. The Business Roundtable statement in 2019 was essentially each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our country. And who could argue with this statement? In fact, there's an FT article where the Shell CEO's daughter asks him, why don't you close your oil company and sell everything off and give the proceeds to Greenpeace. Now, if he followed the Business Roundtable statement, he could well do what she asked and be perfectly justified. The problem is these statements, which emphasize everybody as important, essentially means nobody is important. We simply don't have a standard by which firms will prioritize given these statements. And moreover, when you make these statements, firms are held to impossible standards by every aggrieved stakeholder. And that's what we see. A lot of the firms that signed the Business Roundtable statement are now being held up as not practicing what they preached during the pandemic. The broader point is making a desirable widget at an affordable price while paying reasonable wages to workers not relevant anymore as we make these broader statements? Now, I want to make just 3 points and I'll stop. First, that having an objective, even an objective that seems as crass as shareholder value maximization, is a good thing. And often is caricatured. The belief is shareholders, that CEOs who practice shareholder value maximization will sell their grandmother if they get another penny for shareholders. The reality is quite different. So is the theory, because shareholders are supposed to be residual claimants, capturing the present discounted value of long-term profits. If others, such as workers and suppliers, are fixed claimants, maximizing shareholder value maximizes the value of corporation to society. And that doesn't mean that the companies run into the ground for the benefit of shareholders. In fact, doing well by doing good is perfectly consistent with shareholder value maximization. However, in this day and age, relabeling objectives does make political and practical sense. Corporate purpose sounds loftier, easier to explain and defend, and sells well with many constituencies. For example, if I want to reduce water consumption, it's a lot less seemingly desirable when it's seen as a cost-cutting measure, and much more engaging when it's seen as a move to save the environment. So yes, there is a public relations role for re-articulating objectives. But actually, corporations can go beyond that by being more specific about which stakeholders are important. That is, go beyond the Business Roundtable to articulate specific stakeholders that are necessary. Anyone making long-term investments in the firm, including debt holders, workers, suppliers, and some customers, are often implicit equity holders in the firm. And the theory of shareholder value maximization loses sight of these implicit equity holders. Sometimes for the firm to choose these true stakeholders over shareholders can enhance the firm's value. One example recently, Google employees went on strike because they didn't want Google to continue with Project Maven, which is a Pentagon program that used artificial intelligence to interpret video imagery, and that could be used to improve the targeting of drone strikes. So they were against that. They said, choose the Pentagon or choose us. And Google ended up choosing employees over a favored customer, and thus over short-run profits. This was good for Google because it would attract employees who had a sense that Google was acting on their behalf, and in the longer run would maximize the value of the firm and its sustainability by attracting the right kind of employees. So it's an example of corporations being quite clear about who their key stakeholders are, making choices between them, and in the process, maximizing long-term value. So I think shareholder value maximization can encompass a lot, but going beyond that can also be useful to enhancing value for society. Last point is, even with this larger objective, should businesses have a social responsibility beyond obeying the laws and treating stakeholders well? I think it's good business practice to recognize societal trends, and acting early can be both socially good and profitable, as many have said already. However, it's also important to know what the limits of corporate action are, because corporations can lead by the power of the example, but should be very wary about using that power to influence political change or to fill in gaps that government leaves. One clear example today is big tech and their policing of content. Many of us ask, who elected Mark Zuckerberg to turn the dial on viewer content? There is no effective check and balance on that. Similarly, if Larry Fink goes beyond longer-term sustainable investor returns to emphasizing an environmental agenda, people will ask who elected Larry Fink to run businesses on the public's behalf. Put differently, government has a mandate and a legitimizing governance structure that business does not. So it is important, therefore, the right answer sometimes is not to ask businesses to step up to fill the gaps that government leaves, because there's no check and balance on how they fill that gap, and they're not held to any standard. Rather, it is to push government to step up. Corporate activism, in other words, has some limits and cannot be an answer to government paralysis. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting points there about the relative roles and legitimacy of the state and the private corporation in, I suppose, setting standards and defining public purpose, as well as trying to fulfill that public purpose. And I could take your points in relation to the ease, as it were, of purpose washing, if we could say, in relation to how companies may be portraying their activities. And absolutely on point in relation to the need to specify those stakeholders who firms are prioritizing. But how do you think firms should then manage the trade-offs which inevitably arise? And we often think of that in terms of the short term, long term, but the trade-offs between the interests of workers or the current demands of sustainability or the current demands of investors, etc. And how how can they legitimize themselves in how they make those trade-offs?
I think the first thing is to do an analysis of your business and who are the entities making investments in your business. Those are the entities that you have to take along with you. Somebody who's just buying your goods on a whim is not really your long-term sort of target, but a supplier who's invested in your business, workers who've built their human capital around your business. Those are important stakeholders. And if you articulate a set of corporate objectives that recognizes the implicit claims that these stakeholders have, and as best as you can, you can't be perfect, articulates how you will choose between them. Many corporations, for example, that have strong reliance on skilled workers will continuously emphasize how much they depend on them and why they're really central to corporate purpose. So I would say articulating that gives people a sense of who's in and who's not in, and therefore allows them to predict better how the corporation will behave. And that sets reasonable standards for monitoring the behavior of that corporation and ensuring it's on the straight and narrow. And if they choose right, this will also ensure the long-term sustainability of that business in the broader environment.
Fantastic, thank you. And again, some things for us to pick up on there as when we come back, and we've got lots of questions coming in around this very important issue about corporate reporting, purpose, the management, etc., of those different obligations. But before we turn to those, if I may turn, Ed, to you next. So the Right Honourable Ed Miliband MP is the Shadow Business Secretary, the Shadow Business and Energy Secretary, and has been Labour for MP for Doncaster North since 2005. Obviously served as the Minister of the Cabinet Office under Gordon Brown in 2007, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change from 2008 to 10, and from 2010 to 15 was obviously leader of the Labour Party in opposition. So Ed, we've heard a lot around the role of government, but we haven't heard directly about it. We've heard people speaking on its behalf, as it were. So it's a good point to turn to you in this discussion.
Thanks so much, Julia. And it's brilliant to be on such an incredibly high quality panel. And thanks to the British Academy for having organised this. And I'm very struck that my fellow panelists have stuck to the 6 minutes very impressively. I'm not sure I'll do my very best. Two preliminaries before I talk about the role of government, and they pick up on something that Raghu said. The first preliminary is about the context, and the context is a burning platform. The burning platform is the inequality that has characterized our society, certainly in the UK and the US for the last 30 or 40 years, and the climate crisis. as well as the economic crisis and the injustices exposed by the COVID crisis. And I think it is not an exaggeration to say that the social contract in both the UK and the US is frayed, not to say has broken down. And just to make the sort of rather kind of obvious point, as well as being morally deeply problematic, this calls into question capitalism's social license to operate and is very bad for business and produces all kinds of instability and dysfunction. So I think it is very much in the interests of business to be part of solving these crises. That's the first preliminary. The second preliminary is to say that I think it is incredibly impressive, the movement, and I think that is a word I use advisedly, the movement for purposeful business that we see around the world and indeed here in the UK as well. And I think the British Academy is a brilliant champion of this, the B Corps, the Purposeful Company, a whole range of organizations. The World Economic Forum has championed this. A whole range of organizations are championing this agenda. And I think they're championing it for some specific reasons. First of all, that I think so many business leaders recognize their wider responsibilities to society, to the environment, and to their workforce. We've seen this graphically during the pandemic and the way that so many businesses have gone out of their way to try and do the right thing for their workers and their communities. But also, and other speakers have referred to this, that they don't see profit and purpose as in conflict. Indeed, they see the pursuit of purpose as the best means of long-term value creation, and the short-term approach not just being sort of problematic for society, but problematic from the point of view of the sustainability and value creation of a company. That takes me then to the role of government. And I think the truth about the UK, and here I'll be a little bit parochial and talk about the UK, I think the truth is that the institutions and regulatory mechanisms that we design can lean against purposeful business or lean in favor of purposeful business. And the way I see it in the UK is that we lean against purposeful business in four particular respects. First of all, we have a system of company law that by and large does lean against purposeful business. The 2006 Companies Act, which is of course passed by the Labour government, and Section 172, which people will be aware of. It is a form of what people call enlightened shareholder value, but it definitely embeds shareholder primacy and the interests of other stakeholders being secondary to that. I think it's a debate we need to have as a country as to whether a system designed at the time before the financial crisis is the right system for now, 15 years on, when I think actually the whole view of business about these issues is changing quite significantly. Now, of course, there have been changes to the corporate governance code, the stewardship code, but they're essentially voluntary changes. So the first thing is, what system of company law do we have? Secondly, the way finance operates in the UK. We are, I think, bottom of the league, according to Colin Mayer, for having institutional block holders. We tend to have a very footloose system of share ownership. We combine that with a banking system that, at least historically, has not been brilliant at supporting the rest of the economy, and government that has been pretty reluctant, at least for the last few decades, in relation to industrial policy. And therefore, the kind of patient engaged capital that you get in other countries, I think, is relatively speaking lacking in the UK. Now, in a way, listening to the other speakers, I think there's two ways of addressing this. One, to try and make impatient capital more patient by the changes you make in relation to stewardship, and that's completely valid. But the other way of looking at this is also to try and find more patient forms of capital to support business. And I think both of them are necessary. Thirdly, I just want to say something about disclosure and reporting, which is obviously crucial in this, and it is very important to work internationally. And I was very interested in what Janine had to say. I mentioned the changes to the stewardship code and corporate governance code, and they are welcome, but they are also voluntary. And when it comes to purpose, and obviously that's they're part of the changes that have been made, there isn't in the UK a systematic requirement for how purpose should be reported on. And I'm struck by how piecemeal our approach is to these issues. If we really want to take purpose seriously, we should be able to define the benchmarks. There's lots and lots of good work going on in relation to this, but I think there is a role for government here. We should be able to define some of the key elements of purpose, and firms, corporations should be reporting on them. And I'm struck that I think the EU is beginning, or is looking at standardizing its non-financial reporting. I think there's a case for the UK to do the same. Fourth and finally, I just want to talk about power. And reference has been made to this, power and the role and voice of workers. Because if we want companies to pay more heed to stakeholders, in particular their workforce, we also have to look at the systems of worker voice that we have and systems of employee engagement that we have. And certainly in the UK, compared to many, many other countries, we are very much behind the curve when it comes to the voice of workers and being involved in companies. And just to be clear about this is, yes, an agenda to hear the voice of workers in firms, but there's so much evidence that engaged employees, employees who are happy and content at work, contribute to more successful firms. And I think Leo is going to talk about this. I don't think we can leave this out of account. So I would say, as far as the UK is concerned, there are a whole number of issues that we need to look at if we want to support the businesses, the many, many businesses, the movement that wants to see more purposeful business. The last point I'd make, the point I would end on, is I think we have seen an extraordinary spirit amidst this terrible time during this crisis. We have seen government, unions, business seeking to work together. I would say that all of the lessons of previous crises is that we have an obligation to build something better. And the combination of the burning platform that we're on and what we have been through collectively means that I think there is an incredibly important role for government and business to work together on this and to meet the enormous crises that we face, but crises that I think actually together are surmountable, but they require determination, focus, and a willingness to change.
Thank you. I'm just struck when I'm listening to your comments there about the question of, well, a lot of these debates have been had for some time. So we've looked at different varieties of capitalism, at the fast, loose, fancy-free capitalism, as it were, of the Anglo-American model, high in equity financing, debt financing playing a different type of role than it does, for example, in the German model. We've looked at the German company model on supervisory boards, and certainly even at the time when the Companies Act was being formed back in 2006, these debates were very live. I think what was new now is the environmental kind of element, as it were, on the block, but the issue about kind of workers' representation and stakeholder capitalism, etc. Those debates have been around now for so long. And my question to you is it really now that this time is different? Is COVID that point, that pivotal point, which means that we will actually move the dial on these issues now, particularly in the UK context, where, as I say, these debates are not new, but we just haven't really kind of pushed that agenda along in a way. Do you think this time is different?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, look, in a sense, Julia, that's up to us. And that's up to business leaders in the UK. I don't think you can divorce the problems that I talked about, of inequality, the climate crisis, and so on, from the relatively short-termist shareholder value model that we have, or at least to the very least, I would say that is not going to solve the challenges that we face. And so the question for business and for government is, are we going to carry on doing what we've done for the last 3 or 4 decades? Do we think that model is serving us well? Or do we think a different model is called for? Now, my sense is that business thinking on this has evolved significantly, that there is a much, much more significant movement than there was that is demanding change and is saying business wants to be at the forefront of change. And honestly, I find it incredibly inspiring, the number of business leaders I talk to who say, this is a central agenda for us. We know things have got to change. We know it's right morally. And, you know, there's a sort of important thing to say about this, which is, you know, business leaders care about the climate crisis. Business leaders care about inequality. And in a sense, I suppose, I think part of my argument is we have a system that doesn't, that in a way sort of kind of is an obstacle to them meeting the concerns they have and the kind of things they want to do. Paul Polman has obviously spoken incredibly eloquently about this. So it's an obstacle to them doing that. It doesn't facilitate it. And I think the joint work for government and business is to say, well, how can we reform our system to meet the aspirations of so many business leaders?
Excellent, thank you. And obviously more to come back to, but for our final panelist this afternoon, Leo, I'll turn to you. So Leo Strine is Counsellor of the Corporate, General Counsel at the Corporate Department of Watchdog, Lipton, Rosen and Katz. And prior to joining the firm, he was Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court from 2014 to 2019, which must be the most powerful standard setter for company law, for corporate law within the US, actually, given the role of the Delaware courts in corporate law jurisdiction in the US, and therefore across, actually very influential across the Anglo-jurist world, as it were. He's also Michael L. Watts, a Distinguished Fellow of Law and Policy at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. So Leo, over to you.
Thank you, Julia. It's great to be with everybody. And I want to pivot off of a couple of my prior speakers, you know, especially Ed, but also my colleague, Rebecca. Walmart. There's a great way to set up a level playing field underneath all workers and to limit worker arbitrage against workers. It's called the minimum wage. Walmart is not associated with supporting a living wage and is associated with lobbying against labor unions, associated with saying to companies, you have to offshore production. Then when your production moved to China, that was not cheap enough and it should go to Vietnam. One of the problems in terms of where we are is trust, as Rebecca mentioned. But when companies, there's a certain level of irony that we have an economy now in the world where the post office in many ways is the most profitable entity. Walmart and Amazon really make nothing. They deliver everything. And they've squeezed actual productive companies for years, and they've done it, to be honest, at the expense of working people. Now, we say there should be a role for government. I'm all for that. And the Chicago School has long said that. Well, in the American system, in stockholders who've been the residual claimants for years, they harvest all the time. It is workers and it is communities. And the reality is we can't just say government should do it, because the influence of corporate power over government has been part of why there's been an arrow going up for the power of institutional investors in the stock market and an arrow going down on labor. And I understand even in the UK, there's growing corporate political influence and funding of the political process. In the US, it's huge. And so one of the pressures for change within the corporate polity has been the recognition that unless you rebalance corporate governance itself in an era where institutional dynamics have changed so much and institutional investors are so much more powerful, that you're not actually going to be able to rebalance the political system either. Because it's been corporate power, and I have to say it, it's been companies that, for example, have refused to keep the minimum wage in the US at levels where it was, have refused to recognize the rights of unions, who have put pressure on regulators to diminish environmental standards. It hasn't been ordinary people doing that. And there's also been a lack of recognition from mainstream investors that their investors are increasingly working people who depend for their ability to invest on their access to a good job, and who breathe air and consume products and pay taxes, and whose overall economic portfolio is not increased by rent seeking by particular companies, because to the extent that they own stock or are invested in pensions, they basically own the whole economy. And so externalities from one company, where that company goes profitable, are paid by these folks, not just in some sort of wishy-washy granola eating term place, but in real economic terms. There's another lack of self-awareness, and I would say that to the extent that Walmart, for example, wants to reduce labor arbitrage, it could support President Biden's support for sectoral bargaining. Somehow, Rebecca, I sense they won't. I don't think they're endorsing the PRO Act to revive the National Labor Relations Act. But there's also self-awareness problems on the, what I call the pour over coffee left. This is when your coffee at Cafe Nero is not, I just say, you know, they're all over London. It's not fancy enough. You have to go to a place where they pour you like 2 ounces. Well, in the US, we have the pour over coffee left. And a lot of them, frankly, haven't cared about workers. And they converged a lot with the ESG term. And remember, ESG is kind of a really financial term because people weren't comfortable with corporate social responsibility. And it's really interesting about where the workers are in ESG. They're buried in the S. And Colin, my friend Colin, invited me to a conference in Oxford until 1 p.m. in the afternoon. And we've been there for 3 hours. I don't think anybody talked about workers. It was all the environment. And I'd ask this of the Shell CEO's daughter. Is she really more high-minded than the CEO or the workers at the company? How many hours a day does she spend Instagramming or other things on hugely power-using instruments of younger people's lives? Well, the power that she's using gets produced by carbon, by carbon energy, right? Carbon emitting energy. Well, a lot of ordinary people work at those companies. And I just want to finish with this a little bit about where we're going. It wasn't the pandemic. The pandemic underscored, and I agree totally with that, it underscored the huge inequality. But the Business Roundtable statement wasn't a leading edge statement. It was a sign that the financial and corporate elite recognized the problems that the center wasn't holding. The election in our country of Donald Trump in 2016 was because he spoke to economic insecurity in a xenophobic, inappropriate way, redolent of the 1930s, but he spoke to it and he won. If you look at the divided vote we had this year, I'm a big supporter of President Biden, but Donald Trump got a huge amount of votes. If you look at Brexit in the UK, we need to have a solution to go forward on issues like climate that have a role for the people who work in those companies and that doesn't vilify them. And we need to converge across borders. I'll finish with this. I think we need more worker voice. I think you all need to go to EESG because you can't be good to the environment. You won't be able to be good to the environment unless the people most essential to market system success, workers, are treated well. And they should be front and center. But there should be a pact between the two E's so they're not competing. The transition of those workers who are involved in the companies that we still buy energy from, and their future is important, and people need to see a path forward. That needs to cross borders, and I'll finish with this. I think the great work that Janine is doing, I think my friend Bob Eccles works probably with Janine and things. We need to bring together principles-based disclosure with some metrics. There's real hope in the Biden administration. I think in the EU, where you have things like workers' councils and others, there are some human capital, I hate that term, human being metrics that we could really learn from in the US. And I think our Securities and Exchange Commission has historically done a pretty good job of bringing things together. And I think in terms of self-awareness, some of the fight between all the high-minded folks involved in EESG and competing standards, if they really believe it, they need to actually support moving towards government regulation, because I think we would be better if we all did the same B- level standards for 5 years and evolved them to the A, than if we continue to whipsaw companies with a cacophony of competing standards and people rent seeking among themselves to do the right thing. Because we ultimately need to make it efficient and effective for these companies to implement the values that you want to see. So thank you very much, Julia.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Leo. And thank you to all of you. Now, you'll be delighted now. I think we have over nearly 70 questions which have come in. So what I'm going to do, we obviously can't go through 70 questions one by one, but a number of them are grouped around certain themes. So I'll just pull out. So forgive me, those of you who are putting in your questions. If I don't pull yours out, I might just wrap it into one of those which is coming in and has been coming to the top of the list. One of those is we've heard a lot about standards and the need for metrics and the need for reporting. And one set of questions which is coming in, which is well articulated by Mary Pizzey of Regenerate, is will the most powerful changes come by requiring companies to consider report their stakeholder responsibilities, or by encouraging, incentivizing them? So in other words, another is rephrased by another questioner, which is regulation is often about making people not do things or tell them things they can't do. Should we be shifting that to incentivizing companies to be doing the right thing? So that balance there. So I'm going to throw that one open to the panel, whoever wants to dive in first on that one.
Well, Julia, this is Leo, and I did a lot of corporate law for a long time. I think one of the things that we shouldn't overestimate is fearing that companies can be unresponsive to the profit motive of their investors if we change the rule to require that their boards be other regarding towards stakeholders while they're in office. The realities of competitive global markets and institutional investor power means that stockholders have many more accountability tools than they would have had 50 years ago. And so I think the dangers are more in letting outliers. The problem with just incentives and not having a level playing field is the kind of arbitrage I think that Rebecca was warning against and trying to have. And so I think the balance should be to have every company that's societally important have a shall obligation to the stakeholders. And frankly, to put some responsibility on institutional investors to be disclosing their own ESG policies and really having to live up to them. And that I think is the more effective approach. And I still don't think I don't think anybody needs to worry that means companies will be free from having to really focus on the bottom line, because I just think that's unrealistic in the world we have to think that you can survive as a company. And we also forget, and I'll finish with this, no constituency cares more about the sustained profitability of the company than one constituency, and it's not the stockholders. It's the people who go to work at that company every day, because they have the most deep investment economically in the company, and they want it to succeed more than anybody else, because that's what their family's future depends on.
Yeah. Saka, you wanted to come in.
So I just, I mean, my heart is 100% with Leo's assertion that we have to look after workers. But I think, but I really struggle with a thread that's gone through this conversation. Talk about as if there is a world in which the government exists, that's where Ed lives. There's a world where economics lives, that's where the professors, all of you live. There's a world where the real world lives, where people who go to work live. Then there's a world where finance lives. Actually, it's not true, it's all the same world. So the shareholder often of companies are the workers who in fact go and work in the companies. I mean, they're not the shareholders of that company collectively, but if you put, like, say, a Venn diagram, collectively they own, you know, if you have I mean, I'm talking to you, if you have an index investment in the S&P 500, effectively you're a shareholder in the S&P 500. They're also the customers of that. So this idea that we're talking about separate entities here competing doesn't make sense. The problem is we've created this feeling that somehow when you have a CEO, she works for one set of workers and she's divorced from everybody else, which doesn't make sense. So I think the way you get change, yes, of course you need regulation, because you need to, I'm with Ed, you need to stop blocks that allow movement. But I think change comes when society recognizes change. And I think society is recognizing change. I take great pride from the fact that in this COVID crisis, we chose to inoculate the elderly first. In a pure econometrics model, it doesn't make sense at all, right? If this is the profit motive, it's a completely nonsense statement. But it's the right thing to do. It has absolutely no return whatsoever, but it's the right thing to do. And society wants to do it because they feel there's more to life than just whatever economics tells you financial returns are. And that's where social license comes in. So it's a convoluted way of saying we're approaching this the wrong way around. I think society does want to move. I think society is represented in the workers. The workers are part owners. I think we have to give workers more voice directly on the boards, yes, but also through their shareholding activity. That's why it should be stewardship, so that when Larry sends out a letter, it shouldn't be about what Larry says. It should be about what his shareholders are saying. And then I think we should take away the blocks that stop a good CEO from doing what she wants to do because she feels that she might fall foul of fiduciary law or corporate law. That's about it. The thing about common language is just so that we begin to talk together, and it is moving. I mean, look, SASB and the integrated accounting are now one and the same. We will move to where we want to go to, right? Mm-hmm. But this is a societal move in reality. Because I think, and I'll shut up now, we as a society, and I'm going back to Ed's thing about a burning platform. Look, I mean, if we don't solve this, then in 30, 40 years, we're going to have parts of the Netherlands underwater. The price of food and the price of medicine is going to be through the roof. And social disruption in our societies are going to be very, very uncomfortable, specifically for an immigrant like me, because you don't want to be an immigrant when society starts falling apart. But I mean, for everybody, right? So we're all, in we've got to kind of move. And I think we are moving. It's about enabling. I'll stop now.
Excellent. Rebecca, did you want to come in? Oh, Rebecca, I can't hear you.
Great fan. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm a great fan of both carrots and sticks. You know, Leo, I think, really thinks we have a profound political problem, that firms do not want to do the right thing by their workforce. And I'm completely with him that moves like raising the minimum wage and enabling the formation of unions is incredibly important. But at the same time, I don't want to write off those firms that do want to make a difference. It turns out that Walmart's CEO has in fact been lobbying to raise the minimum wage and is trying to make a difference. And so I think we need both. So Sacker's point that we don't want to disable a CEO that wants to do the right thing because they're afraid they'll get caught out by the law, coupled with effective regulation, seems to me the best of both worlds.
Excellent. Thank you. So I think we've got a good kind of range there, and hopefully that's helped address some of that question for some people who are with us this afternoon. Another point which has been brought out by quite a few people asking questions is actually the role of the consumer. And we haven't really focused on that. So Saki, you talked about customers, but all as quasi their role as investors as well in that dual role. And there's a couple of questions which have come in around the role of the consumer. One is that to reflect on the issue that if consumers want to use their own purchasing power to help drive change and to allocate their own capital, as it were, to companies whose purposes they agree with or are aligned with those, that in order to do that, they need much better information than they currently have. So what role is there for some of the standards that we've been talking about, which are actually orientated towards the professional, the technical, of qualified accountants, etc., to be able to be the main audiences of those and the professional investors? What role is there for a form of standard or mark or whatever it might be, information to go to the consumers so they themselves can be directing their own purchasing decisions? That's one set of consumers. And there's an awful lot of popularity and interest over the issue about government as consumers and whether government procurement policies can themselves be orientated towards favouring those companies which are fulfilling these measures in a more robust, substantive way. Referencing, for example, the Social Value Act, which requires social and economic value and impact from public money in different ways. So two questions there about those two different sets of consumers. So perhaps Ed, could I turn to you on either or both of those? For,
thanks so much. I think one of the questions was from my former colleague Hazel Blears. Let me give her a shout out if I'm allowed.
Absolutely.
So look, I think they're really good questions, and I'll just be as brief as I can be. Just the first, the second question on government. I think there's so much more government can do in relation to procurement, and the Social Value Act, I think it was passed in 2012, takes us some of the way, but I think there's further we can go because government could be a massive influencer of this, and certainly in the UK, government has always been pretty reluctant actually to do anything other than just go for the least cost option. And of course, that just piles up all kinds of subsequent costs on government. So if you go for the firm that's paying the lowest wage, you end up paying out money and social security benefits and so on. So you're actually making a false saving. So I think government, as if you like, market shaper when it comes to these issues and influencing behavior, and there are local authorities in the UK who are pioneering this approach, I think has huge potential. Secondly, just on the question of consumers, I mean, I think this is a really important point, and I think it does show why you need standardization of some kind. I mean, internationally, obviously, as much as you can, but also domestically. And you do need to have some basic benchmarks that companies have to report on. Because as a consumer, it's incredibly confusing, let's be honest, and it's incredibly hard to navigate your way around this. And actually, given the big upsurge of interest in the business community in this question of purpose, I don't see why we shouldn't have a big national debate as a country about what it's right to expect from businesses. What are the key benchmarks that consumers and citizens would want to see businesses measured on, and then they should be asked to report on them. And I actually think it could be a very good way of engaging the public in what it is reasonable and unreasonable to expect from business, what the role of business is in our society. And actually, I think it could help the business community quite a lot. So I think in order for consumers to navigate this, there do need to be some basic benchmarks that companies report on.
Ed, can I just mention one thing? And I don't know if it's a UK and EU issue, but it really relates to this consumer point. In the US, we have a huge divide between disclosure required from companies with publicly listed shares and disclosure by private companies that are huge. And I think one of the things that we really need to erase in the US is that on metrics like ESG relevant metrics, like how safe are your products, how do you treat your workforce, how do you treat the environment, the fact that you don't have publicly listed shares is not relevant. And I think, so a lot of companies that consumers get products from are private companies, but there's no disclosure. And I think we need to work in terms of leveling the playing field, Rebecca, on those dimensions, which would also help consumers and reduce arbitrage against all stakeholders, and would also help investors like soccer, because many of them have working people's money invested indirectly through private companies, and they have very limited disclosure from them.
Yeah, Julia, can I add something?
Absolutely.
Because I feel really strongly on that, having worked for a large asset owner. I think the only way you solve that problem is for the large asset owners to hold their private equity managers accountable for asking their portfolio companies for the same information they ask of their public companies. And that's starting to happen, but we're still a long way. The entire sort of corporate governance stewardship world really evolved around listed companies. Yep. That created a huge gap around the private companies. And so the private companies through the private equity managers need to be held to the same standards. On this issue of consumer disclosure, and I unfortunately can't remember who floated this idea, so I can't give them credit, but I thought it was brilliant, which was basically to mimic the food labeling standards. And, there's no question, I think, that those food labeling standards have changed consumer behavior, something very simple, very standardized that can help inform consumer purchase decisions.
Julia, if I may.
Absolutely. And then Rebecca.
No,
yeah.
I think it's great for consumers to express their voice, but sometimes, obviously, it may not be fully informed. And just to point out one place, for example, where it seems obvious they should be acting, but it may have adverse consequences. Think about banks lending to coal projects in developing countries, right? This seems a no-no. We should move them away to investing in sustainable energy there, et cetera, et cetera. So there are campaigns to stop banks from lending, and often led by consumers. We will boycott this bank because it's lending to Uganda. Now, the reality is that, Ugandans may not want coal power projects, but they also don't have cash to do other things. And there is a larger agreement between developed countries and developing countries whereby developed countries will send, at one point it was 100 billion a year, to poorer countries to help them adapt. Now, for consumers to short circuit this process by essentially preventing those countries from investing in coal essentially kills the bargaining process. The developing countries have no bargaining tools because they're not doing coal anyway, and they're not getting any money on the other hand from the industrial countries. In other words, what I'm saying is certain actions in the narrow may be really good, but in the broader may actually sort of make equity and justice less feasible. We need to think about the overall picture. So in other words, we should all move towards sustainability, but partial actions without taking the whole big picture into account can be detrimental, especially for the ones at the bottom of the scale.
So you're picking up there, I think, the legitimacy point again, are you, in terms of who's best placed, perhaps in this case, to be making these kind of decisions?
Absolutely. Yeah. I do think that, again, there are places where it can work, and there are places we should be concerned about the limits of its benefits.
But if I may, there's a real problem with this, which is why not allow consumers the choice, even if it's the wrong one? I mean, we have the right to choose our government, and whether we choose A or B, and people of B hate A and people of A hate B, but we take it as acceptable. Janine's idea about a label is actually very good. I mean, you know, in some ways, who gives anybody the right to tell me I'm fat? But every time I go down to Greg's, it's a local sandwich place, okay, I look at the little label, and I choose to take the lowest calorie intake that I can for my favorite sandwich. If I had a choice between buying a handheld phone made in country A with slave labor and a handheld phone made in country B without slave labor, slightly more expensive, then surely I would have a choice. That does not negate the bigger picture that there's a moral responsibility on the North to essentially pay back for 200 odd years of wealth transfer with the South by helping them through a just transition. So I'm all for a just transition, but I don't think that negates from consumer choice. And sorry, one final thing. We saw this here in the UK, beautifully illustrated when, I'm not going to mention the name, exactly, be careful, but a well-known coffee company was caught in the local newspaper was highlighted as not paying its full share of taxation. And consumers, almost without coordination, actually, nobody coordinated, there was no campaign. They just stopped going to that coffee company for a week. And lo and behold, the following week, the coffee company decided to pay a higher rate of tax in the UK or not, because these consumers understood that their position as consumers, as shareholders, often of the same company, and as citizens are actually all intermingled together, and there is a social moral purpose for the society they live in. So I'm all for it. I understand the point that Professor Raghuram makes, and I support it. There should be, but we should allow people the right to choose, because this is about how we live our lives collectively.
Sure. I don't want to in any way say that I stand in the way of better disclosure. We should have better disclosure. All I'm saying is we need also a debate around what the consequences of that disclosure will be. And often there are some unintended consequences we should think about. So debate is what I'm asking for, not suppression.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
Rebecca, I can see you wanted to come in.
Well, just because there's been an extensive amount of research in this area, and as a bottom line, consumers don't pay attention to this information when you provide it, and don't switch their purchasing behaviors. There are exceptions. The coffee company is one, Tesla is another, but most consumers, most demographics will not pay more. If they would, I think it would make a huge difference. And I'm a big fan of standardizing disclosure, as Janine suggests, because I think the moment will come. But right now, the pressure comes from employees and investors, not from consumers. They will switch brands if they think one is better than the other and they don't have to make any trade-off, but they won't make trade-offs. Not in general, not yet.
Still some way to go. Yes, I can think within that. One of the other questions which we've circled around but has come in quite directly is around incentives. And the question which has come in is whether cutting tax to reward sustainable corporate behavior creates a perverse incentive, for example, compliance syndrome, comply with the letter, not the spirit of the rule, etc. And I think one could probably extend that to other types of incentives. So I suppose investor mandates, for example. So how do we, if we do move down this route, there will be, as ever in any kind of regulatory setting, you've always got the compliance leaders, and then you've got those who are willing but don't really know how they're really meant to be able to comply. And then broadly speaking, of those who are pretty well informed but pretty ill-intentioned and so are definitely not going to comply or going to do the minimum, and will be pretty able in trying to minimize their compliance. So how do we manage that process, and are there particular regulatory ways, particularly around tax incentives, that would make
but don't we have to do the
challenging? Yeah,
don't we have to do the opposite? I mean, in the US, I don't really understand how we could lower taxes on the haves who have gotten the workers' share over the last 40 years any more than we have. So the idea that we're going to pay them more to give back the workers' shares, it doesn't make any sense. Pigovian taxes, I mean, if we were to put in place through the OECD a OECD-wide financial tradings tax, an OECD-wide carbon tax, we could reinvest in our nations. Frankly, we need to restore taxes on higher income people, and we need to set a floor under wages. I think those are the things that we really need to do, and we could plow the Pigovian taxes back into investments in carbon. Investments, I think, in an international kind of Marshall Plan that Raghu suggests around climate change. You know, for example, I have a lot of very good friends in Brazil. It's really hard for people in the West to lecture Brazil about the development of the Amazon if you have, you know, don't have other economic opportunities. But so I think tax that could have a real huge role in positive incentives, but I don't think it's really in paying the haves to do what's right. I think it's to create incentives towards sustainability. And I think that's where some things like consumption taxes and stuff could be very helpful.
Excellent. If I can just move on, another question which has come in is to pick up on this issue of standards and who they apply to, and absolutely taking the point that we have associated in our regulatory systems large with listed and small with private, and we've got that wrong in terms of relative power bases. But there still is an issue that actually vast sectors of the economies in many, many countries are comprised of small firms. So how do we design or develop standards which are manageable for the smallest of small firms, given the other pressures that they have on cost base, etc., for them to be able to move when they want to move in this direction, to enable them to do so without loading them down with excessive costs and complexity? Janine.
Yeah, I can take that, and I can tell you how we think about that through the lens of the SASB standards, because one of our fundamental tenets is cost effectiveness. And the way we do that is by identifying what are the sustainability issues that are most relevant to financial performance in a specific industry. And so if you narrow that lens down to industry specificity and really think about what are the handful of issues that are most relevant to that industry, those are issues that small businesses are likely, if they're not tracking, probably would benefit from tracking anyway, because they're connected and relevant to business performance. So that's very much the way we think about it.
Excellent. Thank you. There's many more wanting to come in, but I've also got a clock which is inexorably ticking down the time. And I do want to leave a couple of minutes at the end for Professor Colin Mayer, who's leading the Purposeful Company Initiative for the British Academy, to give us a few final reflections. Colin.
Julia, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all of the panelists for a remarkable discussion and debate. The issues around whether or not we should be using sticks or carrots, whether or not we can trust companies to do the right things, or whether or not it's simply naive to expect them to do that, whether or not we can anticipate companies taking on some of the burdens of government, or is it right or legitimate for them to do so? Those are really at the heart of what the Future of the Corporation program is seeking to address. And we've had some really important and valuable insights in that today. I would just like to thank all of our speakers and you, Julia, for having stimulated such an important and insightful discussion. And I would like to remind you that we're going to have our third and final session in this summit on Thursday, starting at 2:30 p.m. GMT, when we'll examine how government can support business to become purposeful through partnerships and skills between government and business, pursuing a theme that was mentioned a number of times this afternoon, and that is that we should view this as a problem that needs a high degree of cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. So thank you very much to all of the speakers, to the sponsors of the Future of the Corporation program, and to all of you who've joined this session. And I very much look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Thank you.